Coming up on The World Today. The defense and the prosecution make closing arguments in the Derek Chauvin murder trial of George Floyd. Russia expels Czechs after being blamed for a blast at a Czech arms depot and calls over Alexei Navalny's health. Plus, India sees a record number of COVID-19 cases over the weekend as the capital's health system becomes overwhelmed. We welcome our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. Thanks for joining us on the program. I'm Akaite Afia in Lagos. We have been listening to the final arguments by the defense and the prosecution in the Derek Chauvin trial of George Floyd's murder. And here's what we've heard so far. The prosecution arguing that policing is not on trial in the case. Prosecution attorney Steve Schleicher told the jury an hour ago that the case is called the State of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin. Also, that George Floyd, when officers pulled him out of the car and put him on the ground, he had responded with thank you, as has been made out from Derek Chauvin's body cam footage. Also from the prosecution, Floyd has asked for help with his breath, with his final words, "Please, I can't breathe," and that the defendant did not help. He stayed on top of him, continued to push him down, to grind his knees, to twist his hand and his fingers into the handcuff that bound him, an assault that lasted 9 minutes and 29 seconds.
You will learn that Derek Chauvin did exactly what he had been trained to do.
The Russian Kremlin has called the Czech Republic's actions provocative and unfriendly after Prague expelled 18 Russian diplomats and said it suspected Russian intelligence was involved in a 2014 explosion at a Czech ammunition depot. The Central European country ordered the diplomats out on Saturday, prompting Moscow to expel 20 Czech diplomats on Sunday in retaliation. The revelation that the GRU, that's Russian military intelligence, was behind the blast has sparked a major diplomatic row between Prague and Moscow. It has, however, raised concerns about what the GRU is capable of, whether it can be deterred, and what other operations it may have already undertaken. European intelligence services believe that the mission of Unit 2915 of the GRU is sabotage, subversion, and assassination. Following the Salisbury poisoning in the UK in 2018, security services across Europe have been methodically working to trace its actions, following the movements of the 20 or so officers who undertake clandestine missions abroad. Well, let's get more on the Derek Chauvin trial from our Washington correspondent, Maria Bird. Maria, thanks for joining us on the program.
Thank you, Akaite. Thank you.
So what in the defense's argument could help sway the jury in Derek Chauvin's favor?
Well, the biggest question is going to be, was it an unreasonable amount of force? And that is really where the defense is going to have to work very hard to prove that it's not an unreasonable amount of force. As we saw, the prosecution just gave their closing arguments, and they were very clear. They showed some very compelling footage of George Floyd in the position, almost turning blue in the face. And so they've done a very good job of really being able to appeal to the emotions of the jury. So the defense is going to have to try to take that away. Obviously, that emotional appeal that was made by the prosecution, and really prove that what he did was within the duties of a police officer.
Well, we are yet to hear the final closing arguments from the defense, but we have seen the prosecution argue intensely on the fact that Derek Chauvin's knee was on Floyd's neck for over 9 minutes. Do you think that there is something that could sway this jury as well?
What's going to really potentially sway the jury is, I think they're going to bring up the drug issue again, obviously. They're going to bring up potentially how that drug, the amount of drug that he had in his system, potentially could have impacted the death of George Floyd. And so those are going to be some very strong, compelling pieces they'll try to focus in there. They'll also try to focus in on those bystanders and that their agitation pushed Derek Chauvin to continue with the amount of force that he was using on George Floyd. But that is still going to be a very hard stretch for them due to the fact that there has been several witnesses, and the prosecution in their closing arguments also noted that police training does not require that sort of use of force. And they also noted that where there was an officer that came to the scene that asked them to turn George Floyd on his side, which is a position to try to ensure the life and safety of someone that is being detained by police.
And Maria, what happens after today? How soon will Derek Chauvin know his fate in this trial?
You know, it's very likely that this could be by the end of the week. Obviously, they were going to deliberation, the prosecution. It could be earlier than that, but I would expect to see that we will probably see some sort of an outcome before the end of the week and by the end of the week. The real question, though, is going to be whether or not the jury will be able to have the consensus and the number of jurors to agree either in favor of the prosecution and convicting Derek Chauvin or in favor of the defense and allowing him to go free. Because remember, there are several charges that exist against Derek Chauvin. So we could see one of the two charges. We could see all of the charges being brought forth. So we shall see in the coming days.
Right. Well, we'll definitely be keeping our eyes close on the situation there. Maria, thanks for joining us. Do stay safe.
Thank you for having me.
Meanwhile, Germany has welcomed the planned transfer of jailed Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny to a prison after 20 days of a hunger strike that has brought international warnings of consequences should the politician die in jail. German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, during a press conference earlier today, said the good news is that Navalny seems to be getting the medical care he so desperately needs. He says the German government will monitor his progress very closely, but that the concern is in Navalny's physical condition, which is worsening due to imprisonment. Meanwhile, Russia has shot down what it calls provocative calls for nationwide protests in support of Alexei Navalny. During a conference call with reporters earlier today, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said unauthorized rallies in support of Navalny would be considered illegal by the authorities. Police have warned supporters of the jailed critic against participating in large demonstrations called by the opposition in 39 cities on Wednesday. Navalny's allies have announced plans for what they hope will be the largest protest in modern Russian history on Wednesday. The United States has warned Russia that it will pay a price if Navalny dies in jail from his hunger strike. As Alexei Navalny's health is attended to in the hospital, his allies who have not had access to him since last week say they are braced for bad news about his health, which is the reason why they are planning the huge countrywide. Navalny's case has further isolated Moscow at a time when U.S. President Joe Biden's administration has announced tougher economic sanctions, and the Czech Republic, an EU and NATO member, has expelled Russian spies, accusing Moscow of a role in the deadly 2014 explosions at an arms storage depot. Russia's prison service said in a statement that a decision had been taken to transfer the 44-year-old Navalny to a regional prison hospital, although it did not make clear whether the transfer had already taken place. The VOA's Charles Main is in St. Petersburg, from where he joins us now. Charles, thanks for joining us on the program.
Good to be with you.
So there is a lot of concern over Navalny's health. How badly has it deteriorated?
Well, the truth is we don't really know. As you noted in your opening piece, authorities say he was evacuated to another prison hospital. They say he's in satisfactory condition. Navalny's allies over the weekend were sounding the alarm, saying that also saying there was no reason to trust prison officials today, as they noted this transfer, saying they can't trust anyone to inspect Navalny except their own doctors that they trust. And this has all happened against this public pressure campaign and appeals by government to the government to give access to Navalny. That hasn't happened yet. Also worrisome are these recent blood analysis samples that were released over the weekend by Navalny's lawyers and family that seemed to show his potassium levels were dangerously high. They say that Navalny's doctors say, that means there's a risk of heart failure or renal failure. Navalny's symptoms that he's complained of over the last couple of weeks since he's been on this hunger strike, that includes this loss of feeling in his legs and arms. He says that's all tied to this poisoning last August that he blames on Vladimir Putin. And he's also complained of a bad cough and fever. But, fundamentally, given doctors' access to Navalny is the only thing that's going to really convince people that they're not witnessing an assassination in slow motion at this point.
Well, Charles, you have the international community warning of consequences if anything does happen to him, and the Kremlin responding that it did not take kindly to the provocation. So what could happen should Navalny die in prison, and what could the U.S. and other allies who have been threatening with sanctions do, and what could the Kremlin's response be in response to that? So I ask this because of what happened to Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. There was a lot of condemnation for his murder, but very little had been done afterwards against his perpetrators.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think presumably we'd see a ratcheting up of more sanctions and presumably from the Russian side, counter sanctions. In other words, we go back to this kind of pattern we've been in over the last several years in East-West relations with Russia and the U.S. and Europe. Of course, we're seeing also appeals by European allies and the U.S. to appeal to Vladimir Putin's sense of himself as a historical figure, saying, he'll go down in the history books as someone who murdered Alexei Navalny should he die in prison. But you point to the Khashoggi case, and you're right. On the other hand, the U.S. and European allies and the rest of the world has to deal with Russia, whether they like him or not. They certainly have a wide range of issues that they're looking to make progress on Russia with. That includes Ukraine, particularly as Russia's mounted its troops along the Ukrainian-Russian border. There's the Iran nuclear arms deal. There's arms control deals. There's also gas and energy deals involving Europe in particular. All these things mean that Russia has to play ball with, the West has to play ball with Russia on some fronts. It was interesting, actually, just today we had the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, on the phone with his Russian counterpart talking about a possible summit meeting between Joseph Biden and Vladimir Putin. That was suggested by President Biden last week. So it's clear that whatever happens will involve some kind of balance between penalties and also trying to do business.
Well, let's talk about the blast in the Czech Republic back in 2014, which Russia has said that it is now found that it was behind through its military intelligence outfit, the GRU. So how does this report keep Russia accountable for its actions, as it has responded to the Czechs' expulsion of diplomats with the same action?
Right. I mean, again, we see this tit-for-tat response, right? It's, in fact, the Russians essentially cut down the Czech embassy in Russia down to the point where it's almost barely functioning. The Russian embassy consul in Czech Republic is a bit bigger, so it seems that although they've taken similar actions, the penalties against the Czech Republic are quite stiff. But we're really trapped in this cycle of recriminations here. And you raise this larger issue: what does the West do to deter Russia? What it says is Russia's malign behavior, particularly when the Kremlin denies it or says the burden of proof, assuming there is one, isn't enough to essentially convince them. And there isn't a good solution here. Clearly, we've seen these kind of sanctions ratcheting up from both sides. It seems to be in a cycle. Fundamentally, it's hard to imagine what's going to change the behavior. You've seen also the West try and find a way to kind of fine-tune these sanctions so that they're not hurting Russians. And one of the problems with sanctions is that although once they start to affect the Russian economy, there is a certain rally around the flag effect here at home, where people say, well, look, it's the West attacking us for all these different reasons and ruining our lives. So here we have a question of how the West is going to pursue these penalties against, if indeed it says the Kremlin is responsible for some of these actions, find ways to penalize the Kremlin, but not Russians.
Right. Well, Charles, thank you so much for giving us further clarity on the situation over there. Do stay safe.
Thank you.
Still ahead on The World Today. NASA celebrates a successful takeoff and landing of its miniature helicopter on Mars. Stay with us. Welcome back. India has announced a week-long lockdown in its capital, New Delhi, following a spike in COVID-19 cases there. It is reported its highest single-day spike so far on Sunday at nearly 25,000. The country has been reeling from a deadly second wave of COVID-19 since the start of the month of April. Here's more in our global update.
India has reported an increase in the number of cases at over 273,810 in the past 24 hours, making it the third it has witnessed in a single-day spike of over 250,000 new cases. As many as 1,619 deaths have taken place since Sunday morning, making the total death toll to nearly 179,000. The national capital, New Delhi, which has been one of the most affected areas, witnessed nearly 25,500 new cases and 161 deaths on Sunday, a record high since the outbreak of the epidemic in the city. The country has recorded over 15 million cases of COVID-19 so far.
I mean, it could not be, but what if reinfection, if infection is happening in the general public? Who is going to document them?
The Greek island of Rhodes has opened up to tourists despite a lockdown. Travelers from the European Union, the United States, Britain, Serbia, Israel and the United Arab Emirates are being allowed into the country and will not have to go through quarantine if they've been vaccinated or test negative. And in Peru, all the way in South America, there are fears of a prolonged pandemic as the nation struggles with a sluggish vaccine rollout and record deaths. The country is suffering from the worst moment during the pandemic as the second wave of the coronavirus has hit, with saturated hospitals and vaccines that arrive sparingly. The official death toll from COVID-19 has topped 56,000 and total infections stand at some 1.7 million. This month, however, it hit a new daily record more than a year on from the country's first case. The southern Italian city of Naples has moved into a less restricted orange zone today after 6 weeks of tight restrictions to prevent the coronavirus. The surrounding region of Campania was lowered from the highest tier red, where people can only leave their homes for work, health reasons or emergencies, to tier 3 orange, where restrictions on business and movements are slightly less severe.
And we're back in Europe as the EU's foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, reveals that Russia has concentrated more than 150,000 troops on Ukraine's border and in annexed Crimea. Tensions between Moscow and Kiev have been rising amid the military buildup and clashes in eastern Ukraine between the army and pro-Russian separatists.
The Russian military buildup in the Ukrainian border is very concerning. There is more than 150,000 Russian troops massing in the Ukrainian borders and in Crimea. The risk of further escalation is evident. We have to commend Ukraine for its restrained response, and we urge Russia to de-escalate and to diffuse tensions.
And now we will take a few.
In other news, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says the United States should commit this week to halving its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, a move he says could unlock similar action from the world's other large emitters. The United States, as the world's biggest economy and second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases behind China, will host a virtual climate change summit on April 22nd to the 23rd. Washington has urged world leaders to use the event as an opportunity to pledge more ambitious emissions cuts. Guterres says the White House's own pledge needed to set the bar high.
My expectation is that the United States will be able to present a reduction of emissions for 2030 in relation to 2010 levels above 50%. That would be extremely important. And if that happens, I have no doubt that will have very important consequences in relation to Japan, in relation to China, in relation to Russia, in relation to other areas of the world that have not yet entirely defined these levels, following the commitments already made, namely at the level of the European Union.
Miguel Diaz-Canel has been announced by Cuba's Communist Party to succeed Raul Castro as the party's first secretary. Diaz-Canel succeeded Castro as Cuba's president in 2018. He had been widely tapped for the arguably more influential post of party leader. The transition means that the island will be governed by someone other than Fidel or Raul Castro for the first time since the Cuban Revolution in 1959. On Friday, when Mr. Diaz-Canel had not been officially named yet as first secretary, Raul Castro said that he would hand over the leadership to a younger generation, quote, full of passion and anti-imperialist spirit. Staying with announcements, this is huge for NASA as it says its miniature robot, known as Ingenuity, has performed a successful takeoff and landing on Mars, achieving the first power-controlled flight by an aircraft over the surface of another planet. The twin-rotor Whirlgig's debut on the red planet marked a 21st century Wright brothers moment for NASA, which said success could pave the way for new modes of exploration on Mars and other destinations in the solar system, such as Venus and Saturn's moon Titan. Mission managers at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL, near Los Angeles, burst into applause and cheers as engineering data beamed back from Mars confirmed that the 4-pound solar-powered helicopter had performed its maiden 40-second flight precisely as planned 3 hours earlier. The robot rotorcraft was programmed to ascend 10 feet or about 3 meters straight up, then hover and rotate in place over the Martian surface for half a minute before settling back down on its 4 legs. Well, that is all we have for the program today. I'm Akaite Afia. Have a great evening and stay safe.